In the bustling hallway of the county courthouse, a veteran police officer stood with his hand resting aggressively on his heavy leather utility belt. "Get out of here before I throw you in a holding cell," he barked, sneering down at the unassuming black woman standing before him. He was utterly convinced she was just another clueless defendant who had wandered into the restricted staff corridor. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she simply stared directly at his silver badge, silently memorizing the engraved numbers. What happened next would destroy that officer's career forever. Morning sunlight sliced through the tall, arched windows of the county courthouse, casting long, geometric shadows across the polished marble floors. Officer Daniel Brooks stood guard near the rear staff entrance, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He had been on the city police force for many years, a tenure that had hardened his worst instincts. Instead of wisdom, those years had given him a bloated sense of superiority and a deeply ingrained habit of making snap judgments based on nothing but his own prejudice. Officer Brooks was not supposed to be working courthouse security that day. He was a patrol veteran, but a recent string of excessive force complaints, including a highly publicized incident in which he had aggressively manhandled a local bakery owner over a minor parking infraction, had forced his commanding officer, Captain Robert Hale, to pull him off the streets. Reassigned to door duty while Internal Affairs conducted their review, Brooks was seething. He viewed the assignment as beneath him, a humiliating babysitting job for men in suits. Footsteps echoed down the long corridor leading from the rear parking garage. Brooks straightened up slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the approaching figure. It was a woman in her early 40s carrying a large, heavy cardboard box filled with thick legal volumes, a few desk ornaments, and a framed photograph. She wore a simple beige trench coat over a modest navy blue dress, her hair pulled back into a neat professional bun. This was Judge Helen Carver. What Brooks did not know, and what his prejudiced mind could not fathom, was that Helen was not only a brilliant legal mind with 2 decades of flawless litigation experience, but she had also just been appointed as the newest Superior Court judge for the district. It was her very first day on the bench. Because she had not yet moved into her permanent chambers, Helen was using the rear entrance to bring in her personal effects before the official swearing-in ceremony and her morning docket. She adjusted the heavy box in her arms, letting out a quiet sigh as she approached the double glass doors marked "Restricted Access, Judiciary and Authorized Personnel Only." Brooks stepped directly into her path, blocking the doors with his imposing frame. "Read the sign," he snapped, not bothering to offer a greeting. His tone was laced with immediate condescension. Helen stopped, balancing the box on her hip. She looked at the officer, slightly taken aback by the hostility radiating from him. "Good morning, officer. I'm heading up to the 3rd-floor chambers. I just need to get through here." "I don't care where you think you're heading," Brooks replied, his voice rising. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with unfiltered disdain. "The sign says restricted access. That means court staff and judges only. The public entrance is around the front of the building, past the metal detectors. You need to turn around and walk away, now." Helen maintained her composure. She was no stranger to being underestimated or profiled. Throughout her entire career, from law school to the prosecutor's office, she had fought against men who looked exactly like Daniel Brooks, men who assumed she was a secretary, a court reporter, or a defendant's grieving relative. She took a slow, calming breath. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job. My ID badge is at the bottom of my purse, which is underneath this box. If you could just open the door, I can set this down on the security desk inside and show you my credentials." Brooks let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Yeah, nice try. Do you think I was born yesterday? Listen, lady, I don't care if your boyfriend is on trial today or if you're trying to sneak in some contraband to your brother in lockup. You're not getting through this door. So take your little box of junk and get out of this hallway before I decide to cite you for trespassing." The blatant disrespect in his words hung heavy in the cold air of the corridor. Helen's eyes hardened. The polite smile vanished from her face, replaced by the stoic, impenetrable expression that had terrified opposing counsel for years. "Excuse me?" she asked softly, the quiet volume of her voice carrying a sharp edge. "What exactly did you just accuse me of?" "You heard me?" Brooks aggressively stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He was intentionally trying to use his height and his uniform to intimidate her. "I know how this works. You people always think you can talk your way past security." I said, "Get out. I'm not going to tell you again." "Officer," Helen said, her voice dropping an octave and radiating absolute authority, "You are making a profound mistake. I strongly advise you to step aside." Brooks's face turned a violent shade of crimson. In his many years on the force, he was accustomed to people cowering when he raised his voice. He demanded absolute compliance, and this woman's refusal to back down infuriated him. He reached out his heavy hand, grabbing her forcefully by the shoulder of her trench coat. Shoving his weight forward, Brooks practically pushed Helen backward. The sudden physical assault caused the heavy cardboard box to slip from her grasp. It crashed onto the marble floor, splitting open. Heavy leather-bound books spilled out, sliding across the polished stone. The framed photograph of Helen's late father, the man who had worked 2 jobs to send her to law school, shattered, the glass fracturing into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. Helen stumbled back a step, catching her balance before she could fall. A terrifying silence fell over the hallway. "I told you to get out!" Brooks yelled, his hand dropping down to rest on his handcuffs. "Next time you're going out of here in silver bracelets, pick up your garbage and use the front door like the rest of the public." Helen stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mix of adrenaline and profound righteous anger flooding her veins. She looked down at the shattered glass over her father's smiling face. She slowly raised her head and locked eyes with Brooks. She didn't shout back. She didn't curse. She simply studied the silver shield pinned to his chest. "Officer Daniel Brooks," she read aloud, committing the name and the badge number 4482 to her memory. "Remove your hand from your belt." "Are you giving me orders now?" Brooks scoffed, though an imperceptible tremor of unease crawled up his spine at how terrifyingly calm she was. Most people would be screaming or crying by now. She was looking at him as if he were a bug under a microscope. "I'm giving you an opportunity to de-escalate before you ruin your own life," Helen stated flatly. She bent down, ignoring the officer completely, and began gathering her scattered belongings. She carefully picked up the broken frame, holding it so the glass wouldn't cut her hands, and placed the heavy books back into the damaged box. Brooks stood over her, breathing heavily, feeling a twisted sense of victory. He watched as she lifted the broken box, turned on her heel, and walked away toward the public entrance without another word. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Brooks muttered to himself, adjusting his belt. He felt incredibly smug, entirely unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. Later, the dynamic of the courthouse shifted. Brooks was relieved from his door duty by another officer and made his way up to the 3rd floor. He walked into courtroom 302, a grand wood-paneled room that commanded respect. He swaggered down the central aisle, passing the gallery benches, and stepped past the wooden bar. He was the star witness in a high-profile narcotics trafficking case. The district attorney's office needed his testimony to secure a conviction, and Brooks was eager to take the stand. A major conviction like this would force Captain Hale to put him back on active street duty and clear his name with internal affairs. He leaned against the prosecutor's table, smirking as he chatted with Assistant District Attorney Kevin Holt. "You ready for this, Brooks?" Holt asked, shuffling through a stack of manila folders. "Born ready, counselor," Brooks grinned, puffing out his chest. "Should be an open and shut case. Actually had to deal with some crazy woman downstairs trying to sneak into the staff halls earlier. Had to toss her out on her ear. The trash they let wander around this building is unbelievable." Holt frowned, slightly distracted by his notes. "Just keep your focus on the stand. We have a new judge today taking over for Judge Morrison, who retired last month. I hear she's a total hardliner, absolutely no nonsense. We don't know how she runs her courtroom yet, so be professional." "I'm always professional," Brooks lied smoothly, taking his seat behind the prosecution table. Across the room, the defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Mark Sullivan, sat next to his client, organizing his own files. The gallery behind them was packed with reporters, law students, and curious onlookers. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Meanwhile, behind the heavy oak doors at the front of the room, Judge Helen Carver was standing in the judge's private chambers. The chief judge, an elderly man named Philip Morrison, had met her at the front entrance after security had hurriedly ushered her through. When he saw the broken glass and heard what happened, he had been appalled, but Helen had politely asked him to let her handle the situation in her own courtroom. She stood before a full-length mirror. With practiced, deliberate movements, she unbelted her trench coat and laid it across a leather armchair. She lifted the heavy black judicial robe off its wooden hanger. As she slipped her arms into the wide sleeves and zipped it up to her collar, the transformation was complete. She was no longer just Helen Carver, the woman in the hallway. She was the Honorable Judge Carver, the absolute authority of courtroom 302. She looked at her reflection. Her expression was like carved granite. She picked up a small file from her desk, the prosecution's witness list for the morning's first case. Right at the top, printed in bold letters, was Officer Daniel Brooks, badge number 4482. A cold, determined light flickered in her eyes. Out in the courtroom, the side door opened and Bailiff Thomas Reed, a tall man with a booming voice, stepped up to his podium. He struck the wooden block with his gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the massive room, instantly silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Brooks sat up straight, straightening his tie, ready to charm the new judge. "All rise," Bailiff Reed bellowed. Every single person in the courtroom stood to their feet. The rustling of fabric and scraping of wooden chairs filled the air. "The Superior Court of Monroe County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Helen Carver presiding. God save the state and this honorable court." The heavy oak doors directly behind the high mahogany bench slowly swung open. Brooks pasted a respectful, confident smile on his face. Looking up at the bench, Judge Carver walked out. The black robes billowed slightly around her ankles as she ascended the 3 steps to the elevated judicial seat. She didn't look down at her notes. She didn't look at the prosecutor. She stepped behind the bench, stood tall, and locked her eyes directly onto Officer Daniel Brooks. The confident smile on Brooks's face didn't just fade. It shattered. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw went slack and his eyes bulged in pure, unadulterated horror. His hands resting on the wooden table began to tremble uncontrollably. It was her, the woman from the hallway, the woman whose property he had broken, the woman he had physically assaulted and threatened to throw in a holding cell just a short while earlier. Judge Carver stood there for a long moment, letting the absolute terror wash over the corrupt officer. She watched his chest heave as panic set in. She watched him realize that his career, his freedom, and his entire life were currently sitting in the palm of her hand. Then she picked up her wooden gavel. "Bang! Be seated," Judge Carver commanded. The real trial was about to begin. The deafening crack of the wooden gavel echoed through courtroom 302, snapping the tension like a dry branch. The gallery, the jury, and the attorneys collectively sank back into their heavy oak chairs, rustling papers and settling in for the morning docket. But Officer Daniel Brooks remained frozen. He hovered a few inches above his seat at the prosecution table, his knees locked, his lungs refusing to draw in air. "Officer Brooks," Assistant District Attorney Kevin Holt whispered harshly, tugging at the sleeve of Brooks's uniform. "Sit down. What's wrong with you?" Brooks collapsed into his chair as if the strings holding him up had been suddenly cut. His heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. He felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down his spine, soaking into the cotton of his undershirt. He slowly lifted his eyes, praying that his mind had played a cruel trick on him, but it was no trick. There she sat, elevated above them all, draped in the heavy black robes of the judiciary, Judge Helen Carver, the woman whose path he had physically blocked, the woman whose coat he had grabbed, the woman whose late father's photograph he had shattered on the hard marble floor a short while earlier. Her expression was a masterclass in judicial composure. She didn't glare at him. She didn't smirk. She simply arranged the files on her bench with meticulous, deliberate movements, her face a mask of absolute terrifying neutrality. To the rest of the courtroom, she looked like a focused professional jurist, ready to hear her first case. To Brooks, she looked like an executioner casually sharpening an axe. "We are on the record in the matter of the state versus Jordan Hale," Judge Carver announced, her voice projecting clearly through the microphone. It was the exact same smooth, commanding tone she had used in the hallway when she warned him he was making a profound mistake. "Are the people ready to proceed?" "The people are ready, Your Honor," Holt said, standing up enthusiastically. "We call our first and primary witness, Officer Daniel Brooks, to the stand." Brooks felt his stomach plummet into his heavy black boots. He swallowed hard, his throat as dry as sandpaper. He pushed himself up from the table, his legs feeling like lead. Every step toward the witness box felt like a march to the gallows. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the floor, terrified to meet the judge's gaze. Bailiff Thomas Reed approached with a worn Bible. "Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Brooks croaked, His voice, usually a booming instrument of intimidation, sounded thin and reedy. "Please be seated and state your name and badge number for the record," the bailiff instructed. Brooks sat heavily in the wooden chair. He adjusted the microphone. "Officer Daniel Brooks, badge number 4482. He couldn't help it. As he said the numbers, his eyes involuntarily darted up to the bench. Judge Carver was looking directly at him. She held a sleek silver pen, tapping it lightly against a legal pad. He knew with absolute horrifying certainty that she already knew his badge number by heart. "Officer Brooks," Holt began, stepping out from behind the prosecution table, "can you please direct the jury's attention to the night in question? You were on routine patrol in the downtown district, correct?" "That is correct," Brooks answered, wiping his sweaty palms on the fabric of his trousers. "And during that patrol, you initiated a traffic stop on a blue sedan driven by the defendant, Mr. Jordan Hale. Could you explain to the court your probable cause for initiating that stop?" Brooks knew this script. He had recited it dozens of times in his career. It was the standard narrative he used to justify pulling over young men he simply didn't like the look of. "I observed the vehicle swerving slightly within its lane. When I ran the plates, it came back registered to an address in a known high-crime area. As I approached the vehicle, I immediately detected the strong odor of marijuana, giving me probable cause to initiate a search of the interior." "Objection," defense attorney Mark Sullivan called out, standing up. "Calls for a legal conclusion regarding probable cause. The officer can state his observations, not rule on their legality." "Sustained," Judge Carver said smoothly. "The jury will disregard the officer's statement regarding probable cause. Officer, please restrict your testimony strictly to what you physically observed." Brooks bristled. It was a minor correction, a standard judicial ruling, but in his panicked state, he felt like she was already tightening the noose. "I smelled marijuana," Brooks amended, his jaw clenching, "and upon searching the vehicle—" "What did you discover?" Holt prompted, oblivious to the psychological warfare happening in front of him. "I discovered a hidden compartment under the passenger seat containing 3 plastic bags," Brooks said, his confidence returning slightly as he recounted the physical evidence. The bags contained a large quantity of prescription narcotics, specifically oxycodone not prescribed to the defendant. "Did the defendant cooperate with this search?" Holt asked. Brooks hesitated. This was the crux of his police report. He had written that Jordan Hale had been belligerent, aggressive, and had actively resisted, which justified Brooks physically throwing the young man onto the hood of the cruiser and leaving nasty bruises on his wrist from the handcuffs. Brooks looked at Holt, then stole a glance at Judge Carver. She was leaning forward slightly, her dark eyes piercing straight through his chest. She knew exactly what a belligerent and aggressive civilian looked like in Brooks's twisted, self-serving worldview. She had been one just a short while earlier. He... Brooks stammered, his voice faltering. The suspect became highly agitated. He was shouting, refusing to comply with verbal commands, and exhibiting aggressive body language. "I was forced to use necessary physical restraint for my own safety." Judge Carver didn't blink. She merely picked up her silver pen and made a single slow note on her legal pad. The scratching of the pen nib against the paper sounded as loud as a gunshot in Brooks's ears. "Thank you, officer," Holt smiled, turning back to his table. "No further questions at this time. Your witness, Mr. Sullivan." Mark Sullivan, a sharp, impeccably dressed defense attorney known for ruthlessly dismantling police testimony, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked slowly to the center of the room, letting the silence stretch out, making Brooks squirm in the witness box. "Officer Brooks," Sullivan began, his tone deceptively conversational, "you testified that my client, a 22-year-old college student with zero criminal record, suddenly became violent and aggressive during a routine traffic stop. Is that accurate?" "He was not complying with my lawful orders," Brooks said defensively, shifting his weight. "Your lawful orders," Sullivan repeated, tasting the words. "Officer, in your many years on the force, you've issued a lot of lawful orders, haven't you?" "I have done my job," Brooks shot back, his temper beginning to simmer beneath his fear. He hated defense attorneys. He hated having his authority questioned. "And doing your job often involves escalating situations, doesn't it?" Sullivan asked, pacing in front of the jury box. "In fact, officer, isn't it true that you are currently assigned to courthouse door duty because you are under active investigation by internal affairs for using excessive force on a civilian in a recent incident?" "Objection," Holt shouted, leaping to his feet. "Relevance highly prejudicial. That investigation is ongoing and has absolutely nothing to do with this narcotics case." Brooks looked toward the bench. expecting the judge to shield him. Standard courtroom procedure usually protected officers from having unrelated, unresolved internal affairs investigations dragged in front of a jury. Judge Carver looked down at Holt, then shifted her gaze to Sullivan. "Mr. Sullivan, what is the relevance of this line of questioning?" "It goes directly to the witness's credibility and character, Your Honor," Sullivan argued smoothly. "The entire prosecution rests on Officer Brooks's subjective claim that my client was the aggressor, which justified an illegal search. I intend to show that Officer Brooks has a well-documented habit of falsely labeling civilians as aggressive to cover up his own unprovoked hostility." Brooks's breath hitched. Sullivan was describing exactly what had happened in the staff hallway. Judge Carver remained perfectly still. A heavy, charged silence hung over the courtroom. Brooks silently pleaded with her, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Don't do it," he thought. "Please." "The objection is overruled," Judge Carver declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "The defense may proceed. The witness's credibility regarding his assessment of civilian aggression is central to the disputed facts of this search." Holt sank back into his chair, stunned. Brooks felt the blood drain from his face once again. The shield of his badge had just been stripped away by the very woman he had tried to humiliate. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sullivan said, turning back to Brooks with a predatory gleam in his eye. "Let's review, officer. You claim my client was aggressive, yet the dash cam footage from your cruiser conveniently experienced a technical malfunction during the exact moments you claim he was resisting. How fortunate for you." "Equipment fails. It's out of my control." Brooks gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of the witness chair. "Does your temper fail too, officer?" Sullivan asked, stepping closer. "Because the internal affairs complaint filed by Mr. Ellison, the bakery owner, states that you grabbed him by the collar, shoved him against a brick wall, and threatened to throw him in a holding cell, all because he asked you not to park your cruiser in his loading zone. Does that sound familiar?" "I was securing a scene." Brooks's voice rose, the familiar ugly anger bubbling up and overriding his fear of the judge. He hated being cornered. People think they can talk back to law enforcement, disrespect the uniform. They need to learn compliance. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The jury watched him wide-eyed, taking in the sudden volatile shift in his demeanor. The calm, professional officer had vanished, replaced by a defensive, aggressive bully. "Compliance," Sullivan echoed softly. He walked back to his table and picked up a single sheet of paper. "Officer Brooks, I want to ask you a very specific question. You are under oath. The penalty for perjury is severe, up to 5 years in state prison. Do you understand that?" Brooks swallowed dryly. "I understand. Have you ever, in your capacity as an officer of the law, physically assaulted, intimidated, or threatened an innocent civilian simply because you felt they did not show you immediate, unwarranted submission? Have you ever fabricated a threat to justify your own aggression?" The courtroom held its breath. Brooks looked at Sullivan. Then his eyes were drawn as if by a magnetic force up to Judge Helen Carver. She was looking down at him. The expression on her face was no longer neutral. It was a look of cold, calculating judgment. She knew the truth. She possessed the physical proof of his aggression, the bruises forming on her shoulder, the shattered glass of her father's picture in her chambers. If he said yes, his career was over. The defense would tear his testimony apart. Jordan Hale would walk free, and the DA would likely charge him with perjury and civil rights violations. If he said no, he would be lying under oath, looking directly into the eyes of the judge who was his most recent victim. He would be betting his entire life that Judge Carver would maintain professional detachment and not destroy him. Brooks's massive ego, built upon many years of unchecked power, made the decision for him. He couldn't admit weakness. Not here, not in front of everyone. Brooks sat up straight, jutted his chin out, and looked the defense attorney dead in the eye. "No," he stated firmly, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I have never done that. I treat every civilian with the utmost respect, and I only use force when absolutely necessary." Behind the mahogany bench, Judge Helen Carver did not gasp. She did not shake her head. She simply picked up her silver pen, clicked the top, and drew a thick, heavy line across her legal pad. The trap had been set, and the arrogant officer had just walked right into it, locking the door from the inside. "I see," Sullivan said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "No further questions, Your Honor." "You may step down, Officer Brooks," Judge Carver commanded. As Brooks stood on trembling legs to leave the witness box, He felt a fleeting surge of relief. He had survived the cross-examination. He had held his ground. But as he turned to walk back down the aisle, he caught a glimpse of Judge Carver signaling the bailiff. The real trial hadn't even begun, and Brooks had no idea that a ticking time bomb was waiting for him right outside the courtroom doors. Sweat beaded on Daniel Brooks's forehead as he practically collapsed into his chair at the prosecution table. He grabbed a flimsy paper cup of water, his large hands shaking so violently that the chilled liquid sloshed over the brim and soaked into the crisp blue cuff of his uniform shirt. He had survived the cross-examination. He had lied under oath, stared down the devil herself, and somehow made it out of the witness box intact. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to slow his hammering heart. Assistant District Attorney Kevin Holt leaned over, his voice a harsh, furious whisper that barely concealed his panic. "What the hell was that, Brooks? You didn't tell me Internal Affairs was actively breathing down your neck for an excessive force complaint. You just handed the defense attorney a massive club to beat our case to death with. If we lose this conviction, it's on you." Brooks scowled, keeping his voice defensively low. "It's a bogus, trumped-up complaint by some whiny civilian baker who thinks he owns the street. It doesn't mean anything. Just redirect the jury, summarize the drug evidence, and close the case. We have the kid dead to rights." Across the aisle, Mark Sullivan stood tall at the defense table, his suit jacket perfectly buttoned. He didn't look like a man who was ready to rest his case. He looked like a man holding a royal flush. "Your Honor," Sullivan's voice rang out clear and confident, "the defense calls our next witness. We call Mr. Brian Foster to the stand." Holt frowned, frantically scrambling through his disorganized stack of manila file folders. "Objection, Your Honor. I don't have a Brian Foster anywhere on the defense's approved witness list. This is an ambush, pure and simple. The state has not been given ample time to prepare for this testimony." Judge Carver looked down from the elevated bench with glacial, terrifying calm. "Mr. Sullivan, would you care to explain?" "Mr. Foster was legally added to our amended witness list, submitted directly to the clerk just prior to proceedings beginning this morning, Your Honor," Sullivan replied smoothly, handing a freshly stamped document to Bailiff Reed to pass up to the judge and over to the DA. "His testimony goes directly to the absolute destruction of Officer Brooks's credibility and proves beyond a shadow of a doubt a documented pattern of systemic perjury." "Overruled," Judge Carver declared, her gavel striking the sounding block with a sharp crack. "The witness may proceed." A man in a sharp-tailored gray suit walked down the central aisle of the courtroom. He carried a sleek silver briefcase. He was sworn in by the bailiff and took a seat in the witness box that Brooks had just vacated. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Sullivan instructed, leaning against the wooden railing of the jury box. "Brian Foster," the man stated clearly into the microphone. "I am the Senior Systems Administrator for Vanguard Secure Tech Solutions. We are the private third-party contractors responsible for the installation, maintenance, and data retention of the county courthouse's internal security matrix." Brooks felt a cold, paralyzing dread wash over his entire body. His stomach cramped violently, acid burning the back of his throat. Security matrix cameras. He mentally scrambled, trying to picture the hallway architecture. He had worked details in this building for years. The rear corridor cameras were notoriously broken, ancient relics from the late 90s that the county council never had the municipal budget to fix. He was sure of it. They were dummy domes. "Mr. Foster," Sullivan continued, pacing slowly across the polished floor, "did your company recently complete a system-wide upgrade of the surveillance equipment in this specific building?" "Yes, sir, we did. We finalized the installation of high-definition audio-enabled recording units. The entire county grid went fully operational recently." Brooks's vision literally blurred. The edges of the courtroom began to swim. "And pursuant to a rapid emergency subpoena, I filed directly with the clerk," Sullivan said, reaching into his pocket and holding up a sleek silver USB drive. "Did you pull the raw, unedited digital footage from camera node 4B, which monitors the ground floor restricted staff entrance?" "I did," Foster confirmed. "The footage is securely encrypted, time-stamped by the server, and completely unaltered." Holt stood up, looking deeply confused and highly irritated. "Your Honor, I must object again to relevance. What does security footage from the courthouse hallway have to do with a felony traffic stop? This is a theatrical distraction." Judge Carver leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Brooks with the terrifying intensity of a predator cornering its wounded prey. "Mr. Holt, Your star witness just testified under penalty of perjury that he has never physically assaulted, intimidated, or fabricated a threat against an innocent civilian to justify his own aggression. The defense is offering physical evidence to directly impeach that sworn statement. I will allow it. Mr. Sullivan, you may publish the video to the courtroom. Bailiff Thomas Reed walked over to the wall panel and dimmed the heavy, ornate overhead chandeliers. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on a rolling steel cart was wheeled to the center of the room by a court clerk. It was angled precisely so the 12 members of the jury, the judge on the bench, and the packed gallery could all see it perfectly. Sullivan plugged the silver drive into the attached laptop. "Let the record reflect," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying a lethal, uncompromising edge, "that we are viewing footage from the courthouse security camera of the incident in the hallway." Brooks wanted to run. Every primal survival instinct in his brain screamed at him to kick his chair back, bolt through the heavy oak doors, and disappear into the chaotic city streets. But his thick legs wouldn't obey. He was anchored to his seat by sheer terror, forced to sit and watch his own public execution. The large screen flickered to life. It was a crystal-clear, high-definition angle of the rear staff corridor. The morning sunlight cascaded beautifully across the geometric marble floors. And there he was, Officer Daniel Brooks, standing near the double-glass doors with his arms crossed over his chest, looking thoroughly bored, arrogant, and aggressive. A few seconds later, a woman walked into the digital frame. She was carrying a heavy cardboard box filled with books and personal items. The jury leaned forward in their seats. Holt squinted at the screen, adjusting his glasses. A collective gasp, quiet but entirely undeniable, rippled through the packed gallery behind the wooden bar. Even through the slight digital compression of the monitor, every single person in courtroom 302 instantly recognized the beige trench coat, the neat professional bun, and the calm, authoritative posture. It was Judge Helen Carver. Brooks squeezed his eyes tightly shut, desperately wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Crisp digital audio filled the silent courtroom. "Read the sign!" Brooks's arrogant, condescending voice barked from the speakers, echoing horribly off the wood-paneled walls. The jury watched, mesmerized and absolutely horrified as the confrontation unfolded. They heard the woman, their presiding judge, politely and calmly explain that her ID badge was under the heavy box. They heard Brooks's cruel, mocking laugh. They heard him boldly accuse her of smuggling contraband to a prisoner. "Take your little box of junk and get out of this hallway before I decide to cite you for trespassing," the digital Brooks threatened aggressively, stepping into her personal space. Kevin Holt, the prosecutor, dropped his silver pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden table, rolling onto the floor, but he didn't even notice. He stared blankly at the screen, his mouth hanging slightly open, all the color draining from his face. He looked from the monitor to the stoic judge on the bench, then slowly turned his head to stare at Daniel Brooks with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The video continued mercilessly. The tension in the courtroom ratcheted up to a dangerous breaking point. They watched Judge Carver calmly advise the officer to step aside and de-escalate. Then came the sudden explosion of violence. The footage clearly showed Brooks lunging forward, his heavy hand grabbing the judge's shoulder with brutal, unnecessary force, physically shoving her backward. The heavy cardboard box tumbled to the marble floor, the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass, the destruction of her late father's framed photograph, cracked violently through the courtroom's surround sound speakers. "Next time you're going out of here in silver bracelets," Brooks roared on the screen, his hand resting menacingly on his utility belt. The video showed Judge Carver calmly reading his badge number aloud, gathering her broken belongings from the floor and walking away with silent, impenetrable dignity. Sullivan pressed the spacebar, pausing the video on a high-definition, full-screen freeze frame of Daniel Brooks's sneering, furious, out-of-control face. Total suffocating silence descended upon courtroom 302. Nobody breathed. The jury members looked at Brooks with naked revulsion. The reporters in the back row were practically vibrating with adrenaline, their pens flying across their notepads. "Your Honor," Sullivan said softly, shattering the quiet, "I believe the defense rests." Kevin Holt stood up slowly. He didn't look at his carefully prepared notes. He didn't look at the defense attorney. He looked directly up at the bench. His political career was on the line, and he knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Every case Brooks had ever touched was about to be overturned. Holt was absolutely not going to go down with a corrupt, lying cop. "Your Honor," Holt announced, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage and humiliation. In light of newly presented irrefutable evidence regarding the credibility and violent character of the state's primary witness, the district attorney's office is immediately dropping all charges against Mr. Jordan Hale. We formally move for a full dismissal with prejudice. A massive, echoing sigh of relief washed over the defense table. Young Jordan Hale buried his face in his trembling hands, crying silent tears of salvation. "Motion granted," Judge Carver said, striking her heavy wooden gavel. "The charges are dismissed. Mr. Hale, you are free to go." Then Judge Carver stood up. The heavy black robe settled around her shoulders as she looked down from the elevated mahogany bench. The stoic professional neutrality was completely gone. In its place was the formidable, uncompromising wrath of the justice system incarnate. "Officer Brooks!" her voice boomed, carrying the terrifying weight of a thunderclap. "Stand up!" Brooks couldn't feel his legs. He gripped the edge of the prosecution table, hauling his massive frame upright. He looked like a deflated balloon, a pathetic, trembling shell of the arrogant bully who had swaggered into the room a short while earlier. "Just a short while ago, you sat in that witness chair, swore a sacred oath to God, and stated unequivocally that you have never assaulted or fabricated threats against a civilian," Judge Carver declared, her words slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. "We have just witnessed you commit brazen, undeniable felony perjury in my courtroom." Brooks opened his mouth, gasping for air, but no sound came out. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice rising in commanding authority, "as a sworn officer of the law, you abused your power, resorted to unprovoked physical violence, and unlawfully assaulted a citizen. You are a profound disgrace to the uniform you wear and a toxic, volatile danger to the public you took an oath to protect." She paused, letting her damning words sink into every corner of the silent room. "Pursuant to my absolute authority as a superior court judge, I am holding you in direct criminal contempt of court," she announced, her eyes locked onto his pale face. "I am also issuing an immediate bench warrant for your arrest on felony charges of first-degree perjury, official misconduct, and assault." Brooks's eyes widened in sheer terror. "Your Honor, please, I didn't know who you were." "Ignorance is not a legal defense, Mr. Brooks," Judge Carver snapped, shutting him down instantly with brutal efficiency. "And more importantly, it is entirely irrelevant. Your true character is defined by how you treat vulnerable people when you think no one with power is watching. You failed the test." She looked past the shattered, ruined officer, Bailiff Reed. The tall, imposing bailiff stepped forward from the side wall, his face a mask of grim, righteous satisfaction. "Yes, Your Honor." "Take this man into custody," she ordered. The sharp metallic sound of heavy handcuffs clicking open echoed loudly in the silent room. Bailiff Thomas Reed marched over and grabbed Brooks by the exact same shoulder Brooks had violently assaulted the judge with earlier. He twisted the disgraced officer's arms behind his back with practiced, unforgiving force. Click, click. The cold steel locked securely around Brooks's wrists, biting into his skin. The hunter had instantly become the hunted. The arrogant, untouchable cop was now just another broken criminal standing before the bench. "Daniel Brooks, you are under arrest," the bailiff recited, his booming voice echoing exactly as it had when he announced the judge's arrival. "You have the right to remain silent." As Brooks was marched down the center aisle, paraded in chains past the gallery of eagerly snapping cameras and the jury he had tried to deceive, he caught one final devastating glimpse of Judge Helen Carver. She was already organizing her files for the next case on her docket, entirely unbothered, her posture perfect. His career was completely dead, his freedom was gone, and it was all because he told the wrong woman to get out. The walk from courtroom 302 down to the basement holding area was a journey Daniel Brooks had made hundreds of times in his long career. He knew exactly how many steps it took. He knew the precise squeak of the linoleum floors and the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights, but he had never made this walk wearing the silver bracelets himself. Bailiff Thomas Reed did not handle him with kid gloves. The bailiff's grip on Brooks's upper arm was like an iron vise, propelling him forcefully into the crowded staff elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing them inside a small metal box, the silence was deafening. Brooks stared at the floor, his face flushed with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and absolute disbelief. He felt physically sick. His entire reality had been dismantled, fractured, and burned to the ground in what felt like moments. The elevator doors chimed and opened onto the basement level. This was the booking sector, the loud, chaotic nerve center of the courthouse jail. "Keep moving," Reed ordered, shoving him slightly forward toward the heavy, reinforced steel door of the processing room. As Brooks was marched into the booking area, the usual chatter of duty officers and processing clerks died instantly. Cops who had known Brooks for years, men and women who had shared cheap coffee and complaints about the dispatches with him, stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes widened as they took in the impossible sight. The arrogant, untouchable veteran, stripped of his authority, paraded in as a criminal. Nobody offered a sympathetic nod. Nobody spoke. The silence was the ultimate condemnation. Sergeant William Davies, a grizzled booking officer who had laughed at Brooks's crude jokes just the day before, stood behind the elevated processing desk. His face was a mask of cold, professional detachment. "Empty your pockets, Brooks," Sergeant Davies commanded, not using Brooks's rank. He didn't say officer. That title had already evaporated. With trembling, awkward fingers restricted by the tight handcuffs, Brooks managed to empty his pockets. His heavy-loaded service weapon and his spare magazines had already been confiscated by the bailiff upstairs. Now he was forced to surrender his leather wallet, his keys. And finally, with a sickening twist in his gut, he reached up to his chest. He unpinned the silver shield, badge number 4482, and placed it onto the scratched metallic counter. It sounded like a hollow death knell as it hit the steel. "Take him to holding cell 4, Davies instructed a junior deputy, not sparing Brooks a second glance. Brooks was escorted down a long, narrow corridor smelling sharply of industrial bleach and stale sweat. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced glass window. "Cell 4. The deputy slid the heavy deadbolt back with a loud mechanical clank. The door swung open. Brooks was shoved inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The lock engaged with a terrifying finality. He stood alone in the center of the tiny concrete box. There was a metal toilet in the corner and a hard steel bench bolted to the gray cinder block wall. It was freezing cold. There were no windows, no natural light, just the harsh, unblinking glare of a caged bulb overhead. Brooks slowly sank onto the metal bench, burying his face in his hands. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. "Get out of here before I throw you in a holding cell." His own arrogant words, spoken just hours earlier, echoed mockingly in the silent confines of his new reality. He had threatened Judge Helen Carver with this exact room. He had thought he was a god in a blue uniform, capable of crushing anyone who bruised his fragile ego. Now he was the one locked in the cage. But the nightmare was only just beginning. A short while later, the heavy door opened again. Captain Robert Hale, Brooks's commanding officer, stepped into the cell. He didn't look angry. He looked utterly disgusted. "Captain," Brooks rasped, jumping to his feet, a desperate glimmer of hope igniting in his chest. "Captain, you have to help me. That judge, she set me up. The defense attorney ambushed me." "Shut your mouth, Brooks," Captain Hale snapped, his voice dangerously low. "You're completely out of your mind if you think the department is going to catch you when you fall. I just spent the last hour on the phone with the mayor and the chief of police. The video of you assaulting a superior court judge is already making the rounds on every major news network. You're a liability, and we are cutting the dead weight." Brooks's jaw dropped. "You can't fire me without a union rep." "Watch me," Hale growled, tossing a manila envelope onto the steel bench. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the city is permanently terminated with cause. The police union has publicly declined to represent you. And to make matters worse, ADA Kevin Holt is cutting a deal. He's testifying against you to save his own law license. He's telling the grand jury that you intentionally lied on your police reports to secure convictions." Brooks's legs gave out. He sat back down heavily, staring blankly at the wall. "Oh, and one more thing," Hale added, turning toward the door. "That bakery owner you roughed up recently, Mr. Ellison, he just hired Mark Sullivan, the same defense attorney who dismantled you today, to file a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against you personally. They are going to take your pension, your house, and every dime you have left. You did this to yourself, Brooks. Enjoy the cell." The heavy door slammed shut again. The lock clicked. Daniel Brooks was left completely alone in the cold, windowless box, utterly destroyed by the heavy, crushing weight of his own karma. The story of Daniel Brooks serves as a stark, unforgettable reminder that arrogant power always comes with an expiration date. He built a career on intimidation, hiding behind a badge to bully those he deemed beneath him. But the universe has a brilliant, poetic way of balancing the scales. By letting his prejudice and bloated ego drive his actions, he blindly assaulted the very person who held his ultimate fate in her hands. Judge Helen Carver didn't need to scream or fight back in the hallway. She simply waited, let him dig his own grave, and then handed him the shovel. True authority doesn't require shouting. It requires absolute, unshakable composure. If this story of instantaneous, brutal karma hitting back hard made your day, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a good justice story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramatic tales. Leave a comment below on what you thought of the judge's brilliant stand for justice. This story delivers a deeply emotional life lesson. True strength isn't found in a badge or title, but in the quiet courage to stay composed when facing injustice and prejudice. Officer Daniel Brooks let his ego and bias turn him into a bully, assaulting Judge Helen Carver and shattering her belongings without remorse. Yet she responded with inspiring dignity and patience, refusing to fight back in the moment. Instead, her calm authority allowed the truth to unfold in court, exposing his lies and destroying the career he had built on intimidation. This tale reminds us that our character is defined by how we treat those we perceive as powerless. When arrogance blinds us, we risk losing everything to the very justice we claim to uphold. Karma has a poetic way of balancing the scales through the people we underestimate. If this story of resilience and justice moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson resonated most with you? If you love powerful stories that inspire reflection and hope, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional tales of real-life karma and strength. Share this with others who need this message. Thank you for watching.